Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. When the coronavirus struck last year and our government initiated their response, there were two very distinct things that stood out to me. The first was the Chief Medical Officer's use of the words vast majority, and the second was the light speed passing of the Coronavirus Act. As time went on, and in particularly in light of the data we now have on the virus, these two things seem ever more mutually exclusive. How does a virus that poses a serious threat to only a very small section of society justify this level of legislation? Legislation that bestows enormous, disproportionate power onto the government while drastically impacting the rights and freedoms of its citizens. The speed at which this bill went through the Commons and the House of Lords is breathtaking. This 329-page bill passed through the House of Commons, House of Lords, and gained royal assent in just 4 sitting days, with politicians from both sides of the House continually supporting its renewal. Suspicious as the bill, which contains extraordinary additional powers for the government, yet dilutes the rights and freedoms of its citizens, was pre-prepared, but yet recommendations to improve our pandemic response prior to the crisis were ignored. In addition, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill has now progressed to the House of Lords and is expected to be on the statute books by the end of the year. The draft Online Safety Bill will be formally introduced into Parliament for debate later this year, but with the government's majority in the House, debates being allocated minuscule amounts of time, and MPs voting without sight of impact statements, it seems reasonable to assume this will pass quickly too. So why is this all important? With 3 bills that are either already law or are on their way to be law that are all converging, and all have a profound impact on what we do, say, the information we share, how we live our lives, and the health of our democracy. I have been concerned from the very beginning that this crisis could be used to further other ideological aims by stealth, using the best parts of what it means to be human to facilitate this. Our innate trusting and empathetic nature, tempered with our sincere willingness to help others, have been skillfully targeted, while at the same time our most primal instinct of fear has been manipulated to devastating effect to ensure compliance. The government's response has catastrophically damaged society, will have harmed more people than the virus itself, and will leave an unfathomable legacy of suffering. I want to bring awareness to this legislation that's getting very little attention and scrutiny in the public arena, but very quietly making its way into law. The legislation itself, it seems, is open to abuse, and if used disproportionately with weak justification, is a threat to our freedom, our way of life, so is something we should all pay attention to. There are multiple things within the Coronavirus Act, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, and the Online Safety Bill that are deeply concerning. Tempered with the changes to judicial review, the government will soon become unaccountable, with legislation at their disposal enabling the silencing of dissenting voices, and the people left unable to hold power to account. The Coronavirus Act is intriguing because Parliament has already legislated to provide for such scenarios. The Public Health Control of Disease Act, which was amended by the Health and Social Care Act, sets out a range of exercisable powers in the event of a public health emergency. The Civil Contingencies Act has also a range of emergency powers exercisable for up to 30 days. So why is standalone legislation, which has a duration of potentially more than 2 years, necessary at all? These extraordinary powers are not all subject to the 2-year sunset clause. Several parts of the bill are exempted from this provision, and ministers are granted the power to renew any part of the bill for up to 6 months. The bill includes powers to detain people, to close borders, rearrange or cancel elections, to drastically cut NHS and local authority care standards, amend requirements under mental health care provisions, and shockingly, to alter the arrangements for oversight of intrusive covert surveillance powers. This last part is particularly chilling. Why is this needed at all, and how is this a proportionate response to the level of threat COVID-19 actually poses to the population? The bill allows extension of periods in which people can be detained, removing previously held upper limits, and the ability for people to be held in hospital indefinitely. Under these measures, a patient could be subject to unnecessary compulsory treatment, a flagrant breach of their rights. In England and Wales, accused people can be detained in hospital, including powers to remand an accused person to hospital for treatment. One could argue that draconian measures could be justified with a corresponding threat, but this bill is specific to coronavirus, and we know that SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 are not life-threatening to the vast majority of the population. There are already examples of doctors who are speaking out against their government's COVID response, being told in their review hearing that the panel is concerned for the doctor's mental health. As we slide further and further towards totalitarianism, my mind wanders to political prisoners and examples in history where political and scientific dissenting voices were arrested and detained for daring to oppose their government. It is possible these powers could be abused to allow detention of dissenting voices by falsely detaining them under mental health legislation. Depending on your worldview, this may seem a little far-fetched. However, Surgeon Dr. Francis Christian was told in his advisory hearing that the board had concerns about his mental health, and Dr. Samuel White, ahead of his GMC hearing, had similar concerns listed by his reviewing board, listed on his rap sheet. Both doctors had spoken out publicly and are either challenging their government's approach or compelling people to do their own research, allowing for informed consent, a core tenet of medical ethics. As mentioned, the Coronavirus Act allows for increased state capacity to conduct covert surveillance. The Act allows for temporary judicial commissioners to be appointed. The concern is that the provisions contained within this bill could be used to circumvent the current rigorous appointment process for judicial commissioners. Surveillance conducted under clauses within the bill can include interception of digital communications en masse, hacking into computers, phones, and tablets, and creating personal data sets without any subject being under suspicion of wrongdoing. This kind of surveillance of our population by our own government is wholly inappropriate when taken in context of the level of threat actually posed to us by this virus. The bill confers powers on public health officers, the police, and immigration officers to impose restrictions on potentially infectious persons. These are people who may be infected or contaminated with coronavirus, where there is a risk that the person might infect or contaminate others. With the current government stance on asymptomatic transmission, it seems a potentially infectious person could literally be anyone in society. This loose definition, coupled with flawed diagnosis by using PCR testing, could result in the wrongful detention of people, the unnecessary infringement upon their liberty, and certainly open to abuse. When you fuse these powers with government decision-making based on cases which are generated by testing that is flawed for diagnosis and produces an extremely high rate of false positives when using high cycle thresholds, placed within a context of a usual winter seasonal spike, surely we face a situation where society could be crippled based on flawed data and overextended powers of the state wrongfully deployed against the population. Powers contained within the bill restrict events and gatherings. The European Convention on Human Rights requires governments to satisfy the twin principles of necessity and proportionality. The Coronavirus Act does not explicitly state that any restrictions must be necessary and proportionate. It allows a huge degree of discretion to the Secretary of State to prevent family and friends meeting, collective worship, and limit the ability for people to strike and demonstrate. The Coronavirus Act has just been renewed again with only a smattering of MPs in attendance and no formal parliamentary vote. This contemptuous approach by the very people who are supposed to represent us towards this issue is in stark contrast to the severity of the legislation. The reason for renewing the Act was to protect the NHS. How are enhanced surveillance powers and power to cancel elections protecting the NHS? Protecting the NHS is solely a logistical and political choice issue. Legislation that threatens the very fabric of our democracy and does more harm to its citizens than the coronavirus itself should never be justified on this basis. The UK has the capability, knowledge, and foresight to have robustly prepared for this eventuality and to have reinforced our healthcare system ahead of the coming winter season, based on the lessons learned so far. On a convergence course with the Coronavirus Act is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. Contained within this bill are powers that allow the police to criminalise protests if they deem it a nuisance and to prohibit it altogether. Limits can be imposed on noise, fines issued, and even jail time for personal participation, with sentences of up to 10 years for causing a serious annoyance. Not only is this completely subjective, but is wholly disproportionate to the offence, with a longer jail term than for more serious crimes being handed down. These measures directly threaten the right of people to stand up for any issue that is important to them. We may not agree with the campaigns that garner attention in the media, but one day there may be something that deeply strikes a chord that we want to take a stand about. It is in this context we must view this issue. The final piece of this puzzle is the Online Safety Bill, a piece of legislation designed to regulate a range of online harms, with Ofcom becoming the UK's internet watchdog, holding platforms to account with the ability to completely block access to sites and apps. These protections are very welcome indeed, especially in protecting kids. In terms of challenging the government and holding them to account, however, there are serious concerns about the stifling of dissenting voices. Throughout the pandemic, the mainstream media have largely been complicit in carrying the government's narrative, with unprecedented levels of censorship of scientists, doctors, and independent data analysis being seen across platforms. Ofcom actually changed their guidance during the pandemic so that anything that brings the efficacy of the treatment into question cannot be said. Even the government's own adverse reaction yellow card data has been censored. The speech from Keir Starmer in the Commons regarding Telegram and calling for tough sanctions against the app may well be justified in some cases. But what he didn't say is that many of those censored scientists, doctors, data analysts, and even some journalists have been forced onto the platform because of the suppression of the information and the total lack of any scientific debate in the public arena. As reported by The Times, the government has directed GCHQ to begin offensive cyber operations to disrupt anti-treatment propaganda by hostile states. Are dissenting scientists and peer-reviewed papers included in this as well? Is legitimate scientific data to be suppressed because it does not align with the government narrative? Whoever decides and defines what is and is not allowed online is crucial and holds the power to sway the consciousness of an entire population. All of the above directly attack our ability to hold power to account, threaten our freedoms, and bestow unjustifiable powers that should never be held by a democratic government. As always, a broader, more global context should be considered in all of this. Australia has reached a point now that's beyond Orwell, with combined facial recognition and geolocation tracking of the people being suggested by the politicians to combat the threat of COVID. Nigeria has announced that citizens will not have access to churches, mosques, or banking facilities unless they show proof of treatment. Israel has allowed its authorities to track the mobile phones of its people, both diagnosed and suspected of having contracted COVID-19. This technology was specifically developed for counter-terrorism purposes. These decisions by governments seemingly unrelated to ours could be dismissed through a lens of democratic hubris. It would never happen here assumption. But as we progress through these times, it seems more and more prudent to employ 10th person thinking and legitimately ask, are they related? Are these policies implemented by governments under the radar of our media a concept proving testing ground for what comes next for us? China's social credit system is an obvious example. This is a call to everyone to consider the far-reaching impact of this legislation and the quiet onslaught taking place against our liberty, way of life, and democracy from multiple fronts. Government overreach and mission creep has been demonstrable over the past 19 months, with no reason to believe this will stop in the future. We are beyond the point of political tribalism or division by our health choices. This affects every single one of us. The course correction needed is not only possible, but easier than we may think. It just requires awareness and, crucially, the will to take action individually and collectively. I want to close by offering some simple but powerful solutions. We must seek out legal and scientific perspectives that balance the incessant asymmetrical mainstream narrative to discerningly move out of fear. Support Liberty's campaign in challenging this legislation. Get involved, join protests, raise awareness locally, and seek out your local Stand in the Park for a support network. Support and register with Liberal Spring, a political solution that opposes this legislation, disproportionate measures, and calls for an open scientific debate. Most importantly, we must unify. We must listen to each other and not allow polarization and prejudicial collective nouns to shut down our discussions before they've even begun. Finally, please sign the Together Declaration and share with everyone you know. Thank you so much for listening.